Hello, welcome to lesson 9.2B. I've entitled this video, Impeachment. This video is going to cover pages 562 to 563. Political problems and a new president. Congress passed other Reconstruction acts over Johnson's veto. As president, Johnson had a duty to execute or carry out the new laws. However, Johnson did what he could to limit their effect. For instance, he fired military commanders who supported radical Reconstruction. Republicans in Congress decided to try to remove Johnson from office. Question 35. What events happened between President Johnson and Congress that showed they did not have a good working relationship? Well, Congress was passing laws that they knew Johnson didn't like. Johnson would veto those laws, and then Congress would override those laws, so they weren't working together. Furthermore, as payback, sometimes Johnson did what he could to get them back. For example, firing some of the military commanders who they had supported radical Reconstruction. So they clearly were not working well together. President Johnson on trial. On February 24, 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach or bring formal charges against Johnson. According to the Constitution, the House may impeach a president for, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The president is removed from office if found guilty by 2/3 of the Senate. So the way that the impeachment process works, the House of Representatives votes, and they look to see is there enough evidence to take it to trial. If so, it goes to the Senate, and in the United States Senate, they hold the trial. If found guilty, and that requires a 2/3 vote, then the president is removed from office. And that would be the description of 36 impeachment. 36 impeachment means to bring formal charges against the president or other actually members of our government. 37. How are the House of Representatives and the Senate involved with the impeachment case? The House votes to see if there's enough evidence to actually bring the charges to the Senate. And if they say yes, then it goes to the Senate. And in the Senate, they actually try the case. And to remove a president, it takes a 2/3 majority vote. During Johnson's trial, it became clear that he was not guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. Even Charles Sumner, Johnson's bitter foe, admitted that the charges were, quote, political in character. Despite intense pressure, 7 Republican senators refused to vote for conviction. The Constitution, they said, did not allow Congress to remove a president just because they disagreed with him. In the end, the vote was 35 to 19. 1 vote shy of the 2/3 needed to convict. So question number 38. What was clear about the charges of impeachment brought against President Johnson? He wasn't guilty of what they were accusing him of. They just didn't like him. Question number 39. How did some Republican senators show character in their vote for impeachment? Well, even though they didn't like Johnson, and even though he really got under their skin, they said that's not what the impeachment concept is about in our Constitution. And it's a good thing they said that, because that's not what impeachment is about. It's not about kicking someone out that you don't like. It's about, did that person actually commit a crime? Question 40. What was the final vote against President Johnson? 35 to 19, or more importantly, 1 vote short of the 2/3 that they needed to find him guilty. Grant wins the election of 1868. Johnson served out the few remaining months of his term. In May 1868, Republicans nominated the Union's great war hero, Ulysses S. Grant, for president. In July 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, granting citizenship to African Americans and guaranteeing equal protection of the laws. Former Confederate states were still required to ratify the amendment before they could be readmitted to the Union. By Election Day, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia had still not ratified the 14th Amendment and were unable to vote. Most Southern states had ratified the amendment and rejoined the Union, but some former Confederates in these states were still not allowed to vote. In addition, as required by the 1867 Reconstruction Act, the Southern states allowed African American men to vote. About 500,000 blacks voted, nearly all of them for Grant. Grant won 6 states that had been part of the Confederacy. With support from most Northerners as well, he easily won the election. Question number 41. Who did Republicans select to be their nominee for the election of 1868? The war hero himself, Ulysses S. Grant. Question 42. What happened in July of 1868 to help African Americans? Well, the 14th Amendment was ratified, and that gave African Americans citizenship and guaranteed them equal protection under the law. Question 43. What were some of the reasons Ulysses S. Grant was able to win the election of 1868? Well, number one, there were some southern states that weren't able to vote because they had not yet passed the 14th Amendment, and so that meant fewer states to vote for the Democrat. Number two, African American men were allowed to vote by that time period, so nearly 500,000 African Americans voted, and almost all of them voted for Grant. Here is a map of the election of 1868, and notice that Grant was able to crush the Democrat Seymour in most of the northern states and in a lot of the southern states that could vote. And so electorally, it was 214 to 80. That's a pretty crushing feat. The popular vote's a little closer, 53 to 47, but for the Electoral College, it was a victory for Grant. The 15th Amendment. In 1869, Congress proposed the 15th Amendment. It forbids any state to deny any citizen the right to vote because of, quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude, meaning slavery. So if you think about it, the three amendments, 13, 14, and 15, all deal with the civil rights. The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. The 14th Amendment gave African Americans citizenship in this country, or meaning that anyone who's born in this country. And the 15th Amendment says you cannot deny the right to vote because of a race, color, or being a slave previously. Republicans had moral and political reasons for supporting the 15th Amendment. They remembered the great sacrifices made by African American soldiers in the Civil War. They also felt it was wrong to let African Americans vote in the South, but not in the North. In addition, Republicans knew that if African Americans could vote in the North, they would help Republicans win elections there. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. At last, all African American men over age 21 had the right to vote. The 15th Amendment was difficult to enforce, and Southern conservatives were determined to find ways around it. It was not until the mid-1900s that new legislation began to effectively protect voting rights, and the full impact of the amendment was felt. So now we can answer a couple of questions. Question 44, what did the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution do? It says you cannot deny a person the right to vote, a citizen the right to vote, because of race, color, or having been a slave previously. Question 45, what were three reasons why Republicans strongly supported the 15th Amendment? Well, number one, African American soldiers had done a lot for our country in the Civil War. They sacrificed a lot. Number two, they felt it was wrong that we were making rules in the South to make African Americans vote, but not in the North. So that didn't make sense. So that was the second one. And number three, and this was sort of a selfish reason, but Republicans knew if African Americans could vote, of course they would lean towards voting for the Republican Party, at least in that time in our American history. Question 46. What two challenges lessen the impact that the 15th Amendment should have had on our country's history? Well, number one, it was difficult to enforce. Sometimes in the South, they would find tricky ways around this. And secondly, there were groups like the KKK and others who would use violence to keep African Americans from voting, even though the amendment said you could not do that legally. There were tricky ways that this would happen, in the South especially. Well, thank you very much for watching. Speaking of President Grant, did you know Ulysses S. Grant was arrested while serving as President of the United States? He was charged, booked, and later released after paying a fine for speeding on a horse. Thank you and have a nice day.